Hey, APUSH gang. Well, we're almost here. We're almost at the finish line. It is Wednesday. Actually, it's Tuesday night, but you'll be watching this on Wednesday. And I have been cramming, reading chapter 22 as quickly as I could. And I don't feel really prepared for this lecture, but I'm going to do my best. I'm fairly familiar with World War II, which is what this particular chapter covers. But of course, AP always digs a little bit deeper than my other course. And so there's some things in there that I think that you need to know. I went back and looked at the required factual information, and it's pretty vague on the list that AP gives. So I'm gonna try to hit what I think are the important things, but I know I'm gonna miss some things because there's no way to teach World War II in a 45-minute lecture. So I'm gonna try to hit the highlights, and then hopefully what I miss you will be able to pick up in Mr. Heimler's review, crash course, and then a few other odds and ends that I have suggestions on. So I'm going to dive into World War II for you today. And of course, I think I mentioned this previously, but World War I and World War II are significantly connected. World War I, the conclusion of the war and the guilt laid upon the German people and the German nation, and running their Kaiser off into exile created a huge vacuum in Germany, which ultimately led to the rise of Adolf Hitler. He wasn't the only bad apple over there. There were a few others, actually all over the world. But America decided on isolationism during the Great Depression and stuck our head in the sand and tried to ignore, kind of do the la 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 la, and pretend like things weren't happening over there, which ultimately, I don't know that it would have made a difference if we'd been paying attention. Maybe it would have made, perhaps it would have made the pain a little bit longer, but we definitely turned to isolationism during the 1930s, during the Depression, and ignored what was happening over in Europe. Now, my friend, Captain America, actually, his superhero status does come about during World War II. So if you've seen the Marvel movies and you've seen Captain America, you know his story. He idolizes the image of the patriotic American soldier that wanted to fight for freedom around the world, wherever it applied. And the Nazi Party and Germans in general, whatever shape they took, were perceived to be the ultimate enemy of freedom, and power hungry. And in the movie Captain America, Germans were portrayed to be after the ultimate source of power, the stones and all of that stuff. So there we go. We finally got Captain America into the story. Okay, so I'm going to kind of jump in. I have 3 different PowerPoints from last year that I taught over the course of 3 days that I'm going to merge together in this lesson. So there may be some delays and some hesitations and some pauses as I try to figure out where I'm at. But I'm going to go ahead and jump on in. So let me put my glasses on. My puppies, I don't know if you can see, I'll zip Riley around. Riley, hold on. Riley is taking a nap and Romeo is also taking a nap. I'll just kind of leave them right there. Hopefully they will not get too barky. Okay, there are, in the PowerPoint that I created last year and for my other class, there are a lot of all kinds of video links that, depending on how long I talk, I will ask you to go and view during the course of the lesson. I'll try to keep the lesson, between my lecture and the video clips to about 90 minutes. And then, of course, I will also have a homework assignment for you to do. And really, I'm going to free you at this point to do what you need to study for the exam. I'm going to give you some suggestions. I'm not going to have you turn anything in beyond today. I want you to use your time to the best of your ability, and I'm going to give you the tools that you need for these remaining 48 plus hours until the exam on Friday. What else was I going to say? Oh, I'm also going to record some videos probably tomorrow because I'm going to run out of steam tonight. And I'm going to go through the factual information, and I'm just going to hit on every topic that's on there. And so I'll create some videos of myself sharing that with you, and you can watch it or not watch it. It'll be totally up to you. I don't know what your level of how much work you've got going on in your other classes. I'm not sure. I'm not privy to that information. So hopefully you're not too overwhelmed, but you can only do as good as you can only do. That's kind of where we're at. So, okay. As we talked about last week, during the 1930s, the United States was embroiled in a horrible, horrible depression that Franklin Roosevelt desperately tried to overhaul the way that America did business and supply and demand and consumerism and the government's role in the economy. He took it to a whole new level through his programs known as the New Deal. The first New Deal, the second New Deal. And essentially, for all of the years that the United States and the federal government withheld involving itself in the growing economy, the 1930s pretty much made up for it. And so the size of the federal government massively expanded. The role of the federal government in stimulating the economy or trying to stimulate the economy during the desperate times of the Depression were massive. Some of the things worked a little bit. Some of the things didn't work. I would say that the New Deal and programs like it gave Americans confidence that somebody was going to help them. They weren't going to starve to death. That there was some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, a safety net, if you will. But almost all historians unanimously agree that the New Deal and the second New Deal did not end the Depression. There's varying degrees by economists as to if it lessened the pain of the New Deal. Some economists suggest that the New Deal actually lengthened the time that the markets were upside down and consumer supply and demand was just completely out of whack. I'm kind of in that camp, although I think that the government does have a role to play in a crisis of that nature. You certainly don't want people starving, and you don't want families living in cars and cardboard homes and that sort of thing. However, perhaps there was a better way of handling it. I don't know. I would have hated to have been in government at that time because it felt like it was circumstances out of their control. But certainly, Franklin Roosevelt believed that the answer to the problem was government intervention and government regulation of the economy. So you have to understand that. I can't remember if I had this slide in your PowerPoint, but I did for the other class. One of the things that Americans did during the 1930s, during their isolationist tendency, was to drown their sorrows in cheap entertainment. And so during the 1930s, that looked like Nickelodeon's movies. Movies became more sophisticated. I have a PowerPoint here that shows, I think it's Charlie Chaplin, maybe Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing. They did all kinds of movies together during the 1930s. Of course, Gone with the Wind came out. Wizard of Oz was released during that period of time. Franklin Roosevelt notoriously did his fireside chats, where he gave basically a presidential address in a real informal setting, I think once a week, where everybody would gather around their radio and they would listen to the calming voice of Franklin Roosevelt as he proclaimed there is nothing to fear but fear itself. And so just to assuring the American people that he understood their pain and he was with them. And so certainly radio during the 1930s was a source of entertainment. War of the Worlds, I just happened to mention that. You guys probably already know this, but Orson Welles read the story War of the Worlds over the radio in a dramatic presentation of that story. And in that story, aliens come to Earth. And because the radio program decided not to have any interruptions of the reading of a story, people that tuned in partway through the story thought that there was actually an alien invasion, and it created panic and hysteria. And so that happened in the 1930s. I included an image of the Hindenburg, which was I think it's called a Zeppelin, is that right? Hot air balloon, for lack of a better word. that had traveled from Europe over to the United States, and it was supposed to be the safest way to travel. It was very relaxing, and a lot of important people were on this across Atlantic trip. And as it was landing, I believe in New York City, they had some sort of issues, couldn't get it to settle and land correctly, and they hovered above the runway for a long time, and suddenly it exploded. One of the things I think is so interesting about the Hindenburg explosion, other than the fact that people were listening to it on the radio, and of course they don't see what's happening, but they hear the reporters freaking out that it's exploded, and is that Hindenburg is the name of the German general at the end of World War I. I believe he was chancellor for a while as well. And when Hitler took over, he wasn't a fan of the guy, but they actually wanted to name this balloon after Hitler, and he says, let's name it after Hindenburg. And so he didn't want it to be named after him. And if you look at, I'm gonna actually have you guys watch this video clip. You can see the Nazi, the swastika is underneath the belly of the ship as it's coming in, and I had never noticed that before. I mean, I suppose I knew it was a German ship, but anyway, it's really, really fascinating. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, also first color movie released. So it was a time of sticking your head in the sand, enjoying cheap entertainment, dulling our senses to the crisis that was brewing in Asia and in Europe. And those are some of the things that symbolize that. So in the meantime, while we are ignoring what's, trying to deal with our own sorrows and sadness and issues with the Great Depression, Europe and Asia was in quite a mess. So I'm gonna turn my computer this way. I think my dog she's having a dream. I don't know if you guys can hear that. She stopped. She's chasing a bird or something. Anyway, I'll keep going. Okay, so meantime, in Europe, I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is going to be a fast summary of all of the world leaders. But in the meanwhile, nationalism is gripping Europe and Asia, actually, both of them. And some pretty scary critters, people are coming, increasing their grip on the countries that they control. So Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was a communist totalitarian country. Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, and Joseph Stalin took complete control. Benito Mussolini of Italy came to power in 1922, shortly after World War I. He had served in World War I, and he took charge of the country in 1922, basically as a military dictator. Of course, Adolf Hitler first was, I think, appointed chancellor with, I think that's correct, but it was 1933. And he espoused the doctrine of Nazism and racial superiority of the German people and a whole bunch of other awful stuff. If you don't know the book that he wrote while he was briefly in prison between World War I and World War II, Mein Kampf, which means my struggle, he wrote in great detail about his view of the world and the best way to run the world and who the bad guys were and the good guys and whatnot. And he was very clear in that book that he blamed the Jewish people for a lot of the economic woes of the German nation, and what he'd like to do with the Jewish people if he had the opportunity. So the German people were not innocent in welcoming him into their fold. He had been very clear about his opinions regarding that. And then, let's see, in Japan, the emperor basically was a figurehead leader. The military had kind of taken charge of the country. Hideki Tojo was the the general, I think he was actually an admiral, and came onto the scene in Japan in 1931 when the Japanese invaded Manchuria, which is a northeastern province in China, or north central, I think. And then in Spain had actually been undergoing a civil war. I think it was in 1939, and it was essentially a war between fascism and then republicanism. And the weak government that had formed after World War I, the Spanish Republic, was having a very difficult time. And of course, Americans did not want to get involved. Europeans did not want to get involved. And so ultimately, Francisco Franco came to power. It was sort of a breeding ground for Hitler's equipment, his armament that he wasn't supposed to be building. As part of the Versailles Treaty, he was building equipment, and he was sending it to Spain to kind of test it out, and to watching from a distance how things fell there and what the Europeans would do to intervene. And of course, the Europeans did not intervene as the fascists took over Spain. And I think a seed was planted in the heart of Adolf Hitler. They won't do anything if I start my ugly ways. And then there's, I have listed all of these gentlemen, and I've got a definition of what their particular political or economic, mostly political persuasion is, whether it's communism, totalitarianism, fascism, Nazism. They're generally all a form of nationalism. And of course, communism and socialism. Communism is more I like to describe it as an economic system. It's also a political system. It depends on what definition you read. This definition says it's an economic theory favoring a classless society and the abolition of private property under the control of a totalitarian leader. And then Nazism was a racist nationalism that put all the eggs in the basket of that particular race, of that particular nation, and so on and so forth. Let me keep zipping through here. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening in Europe. I mentioned this briefly, and I'm going to mention this again. I think I've got it's probably going to come up later, but I mentioned that while all of that's happening in Europe, Japan is becoming aware of its severe lack of natural resources. They actually purchased 80% of their oil supply from the United States up until just shortly before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And if they were going to expand their empire, they needed that particular natural resource of oil. And so they began to concoct a plan, and they knew where there were other oil sources. One of them was Indonesia, which at the time, which I believe was a French colony, Vietnam, also French, Cambodia, and then ultimately their age-old enemy was the Chinese. And the Chinese at the time were fairly weak. Now, technically, China was, I will call them an ally of the United States during the war. They don't usually show up on the list of allies because we were helping them fend off the Japanese. And so it was more about us helping them, and because Japan had attacked us. But we sent in probably billions and billions of dollars between the Soviet Union and China. We sent in weapons and tanks and airplanes and everything you can imagine to help them hold off against the Germans and the Japanese. So, but the Japanese had invaded, as I mentioned before, Manchuria in Chinese mainland in 1931. They had also delved deeper into China, and we'll get back to that here in just a second. But they were also making aggressive movements and actions and imperialistic sorts of things that tipped our leaders off that they were a growing threat. So we had a threat in Europe, and we had a threat in the Asian area of the world. And the book kind of goes into a little bit of detail about how Americans believed that the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean would save us from having to intervene in the problems of the world. And to some degree that is true. It certainly held it off. But eventually the fight came to us with the attack on Pearl Harbor. So I'm going to just mention this speech because I think it could come up. It could be part of a document, depending on what the question is. But in 1937, Franklin Roosevelt, who is being briefed on the situation in Europe and the situation in Asia, gives what is known as the quarantine speech. And this is a quote from his speech. The peace, the freedom, and the security of 90% of the world is being jeopardized by the remaining 10% who are threatening a breakdown of all international order and law. and then he backed away. So he dropped that seed in the minds of the American people that, hey, some bad stuff is going on. I'm aware of it. You need to start thinking in those terms that trouble's happening again. And it was almost like he was trying to prepare Americans for the fact that he believed at some point down the road, America was going to have to come to action. So it was just his way of introducing that idea. And that is called the quarantine speech. That speech shows up in a lot of stuff. So I wanted you to be aware of what that was. So that's as early as 1937, Roosevelt is beginning to introduce Americans to the idea that, hey, this might come to us. The oceans may not protect us. In a very unusual decision, Franklin Roosevelt decided in 1940 that he was going to run for election for a third time. First time in American history that had happened. Every president before him had decided to follow the lead of George Washington. He believed that the recovery of the Depression was too shaky at that point. And because of the situation in the world, we had not been attacked yet. But he believed that it was pretty imminent. And so he won a resounding victory, a clear, decisive victory that the American people were comfortable with that. In his State of the Union address that year, but again, this is in January, and we're attacked in September of 1941 by the Japanese. As the book says, Franklin Roosevelt began to articulate a vision of a new America. Now, if you recall, we've had 10 years of depression leading up to this time. Building up and preparing for the war, which we were doing, suddenly alleviated the depression. Unemployment went from 14 or 15% to 2 or 3% in the course of just a few weeks, as the American industrial complex began to prepare for war. There was even a peacetime draft that was passed by Congress that began to draft men to prepare them for war. So while Americans didn't want to go to war, we were doing everything we had to so that we didn't find ourselves in the situation we found ourselves in World War I, where we declared war and it took an entire year to get us into action. We still weren't prepared when it finally came, but we were moving in that direction. And I would bet that Franklin Roosevelt also understood that moving our industries to wartime production would indeed finally bring an end to the Depression. Not that you want war to come, but that aspect of the war, that is what fixed the economy. And during that latter part of the 1930s, you began to hear lots and lots of economists start to talk about free enterprise, using that word freedom again, the freedom of the free market and freedom of enterprise, and a desire to go back to the unregulated, unmanipulated American explosive intervention, that's not the word. Anyway, industry, the might of the manufacturing sector in the United States and the free market, unleash it, let it go, and you started to hear talks about that. But in 1941, when Franklin Roosevelt gave his State of the Union address, as the economy had revived, he starts talking about these 4 freedoms, and these 4 freedoms become a centerpiece to the American war effort and really the future America. And let me think what his name is. Rockwell. Norman Rockwell, there we go. Norman Rockwell, who was a New Yorker, most of his life had moved up to, I believe it was Connecticut, or no, it was Vermont, living in a small town community with his family after years of city life. He was tasked with the work of putting an image to these 4 freedoms. And these are what the 4 freedoms are. And this is, you gotta know this, okay? The 4 freedoms were freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And so the freedom from want has a lot to do with the government's responsibility to make sure that there's a safety net for people so they don't have to fear hunger and loss of job and all of that. And then freedom from fear was sort of targeted, I think, at the impending storm that was coming our way in the form of World War II. And so freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And so I'll have the pictures of Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms, and you can take a look at them. You've probably seen all of the paintings. And those became the cornerstone of freedom through the course of the war. They were referenced many, many times. They were printed everywhere. They were published in newspapers and magazines. They became the face of the American cause in the war effort, and also what Americans came to expect freedom meant. For an American standard of living, an American way of life. And so if you were to get a question about this era, I'm almost certain that those images would potentially be there. So, okay, somebody just texted me. Okay, let's see here, what else? One other thing real quickly before we dive into World War II. This is a term that you should be aware of as well, associated with Franklin Roosevelt during the 1930s in particular. He on it, as far as foreign policy goes, unrelated to World War II, he practiced something within the Western Hemisphere known as the good neighbor policy. And essentially, he was trying to undo the years of Teddy Roosevelt and some of Wilson's intervention in Mexico and Central America and whatnot. And so rather than he encouraged a self-reliance amongst South American, Central American countries, and even in the Caribbean. He released Cuba from the Platt Amendment, which gave America the right to intervene if necessary. He did a whole host of things, and he called it his good neighbor policy. He was being a good neighbor to his to our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. So, Roosevelt corollary was, we're going to police, we're going to police, we're going to police. We're in charge. We're going to make sure everybody follows our lead. And Franklin Roosevelt instead followed what became known as the good neighbor policy. And of course, World War II just engulfed that. So, I'll just mention this again. Prior to our involvement in the war in 1935, Congress passes neutrality acts. Again, this could be important, which showed our isolationist tendencies. The Neutrality Acts banned travel of American citizens on belligerent ships or ships that were involved in some sort of war activity. And it also banned the sale of arms to countries that were at war. And so companies were not allowed to sell arms or weapons to countries that were at war, regardless of which side we were on. So how that ended up playing out with the Spanish Civil War is that we did not send arms to the Spanish. Adolf Hitler did, to the fascist element of that, and that probably neither did France or Great Britain. And so the bad side had access to all kinds of weapons. The side that we would have normally sided with had access to nothing, because those countries that were like-minded with the Republican ideals of the Spanish Republican Party were not receiving any help from anybody. Now, there were 3,000 Americans that went to Spain and served in what they called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And so they fought with the Spanish Republic against the fascists, but of course the fascist won. Just a side note, Ernest Hemingway, the writer, he had served as an ambulance driver, I believe, in World War I. He went and covered the war in Spain as a reporter, I believe. So anyway, just a side note there. Okay, all right, so the war in Europe. So I'm going to kind of walk through the domino effect, and you'll see a slide that has dominoes on it. And I'm just going to this is just going to really, really quickly tell you how things fell. So 1938, Adolf Hitler absorbs Austria. Austria was his home country, and most of the people in Austria were German-speaking. And if I remember correctly, Austria had been kind of carved out of the German and Austrian-Hungary Empire, and given their, their own borders, but Hitler wanted them to be part of Germany since they were German speaking. And then he, an alarmed European leadership decided to meet with Adolf Hitler in Munich, which is a city in Germany. And Neville Chamberlain, who at the time was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and then the French president, met with Hitler, and Hitler said, I promise I won't take anything else, but I want one more thing. I want the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland was an area of Czechoslovakia, which had also been kind of reshaped and carved out after World War I, where German-speaking people lived. And so he says, they want to be, we've taken a vote, they want to be part of Germany, and we won't, I promise I won't take anything else. And Neville Chamberlain, to his disgrace, pacified Adolf Hitler and signed something called the Munich Agreement. And in the Munich Agreement, the Western Allies agreed to let Adolf Hitler assume the Sudetenland against the government of Czechoslovakia, because he promised he wouldn't take anything else. And of course, he was totally emboldened by their naivety. Chamberlain goes back to England and gets off the airplane holding up the agreement in his hand, and he says, we have peace in our time. What a fool. Some people don't recognize evil when they look them in the eye. And Hitler was, like I said, emboldened by this. On the sidelines in Great Britain was a former soldier, well-greased, well-oiled politician by the name of Winston Churchill, who rarely was seen without a cigar in his hand. And Winston Churchill they would describe him as a war hawk, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, you did what? You told Adolf Hitler it was okay to take a sovereign country for himself? Are you crazy? And there's a quote on the screen here, and this is Winston Churchill. This is a quote of his. He said, Britain and France had to choose between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor, and they will have war. And so he screamed from high heavens. He was right. He read Adolf Hitler perfectly. And Adolf Hitler was indeed not just going to take the Sudetenland. And it wasn't long after that Neville Chamberlain's, I think he was a part of the Labour Party, lost power in Parliament, and Winston Churchill was elected the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, and would see them through the war. And so Hitler takes Austria, then the Sudetenland. This is all in the 1930s. In 1939, he takes the rest of Czechoslovakia and announced to the world, Czechoslovakia has ceased to exist. He and Joseph Stalin hate each other. They are mutually evil and don't trust each other, but they both have their eyes on Poland, which sits in between Germany and Russia. And so they signed a non-aggression pact. Now, Joseph Stalin had been trying to get France and Great Britain, and probably the United States, to sign some sort of alliance with him because he feared Adolf Hitler. But they didn't want to because they feared communism more than they feared this new guy with the crazy little mustache. And they wouldn't do it. And so Joseph Stalin instead decided to cut a deal with Hitler. And he told Hitler, hey, we've got our sights set on Poland, and I know you do too. Let's sign a non-aggression pact. And so in September of 1939, the two of them announced to the world that they had signed an agreement together, a non-aggression pact. They had promised that they would not attack one another, and that they were going to split the booty with Poland. And they did. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, and Hitler invaded Poland from the west. Poland and Warsaw was the Jewish population. So many Jewish people lived in Poland. It was one of the centers of the Holocaust. Horrifying. Sadly, nobody intervened, and the Jewish people were trapped because, remember, Adolf Hitler said, I promise I don't want anything else. And so that was 1939. So that was the final straw. That was when France and Great Britain were like, okay, he's going to stop at nothing. We need to quit pretending like this isn't happening. And so on September 3rd, 2 days after Hitler invaded Poland and Russia, Russia invaded Poland, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. So that was September 3rd of 1939. Okay, so let's see how fast the chips fall from here. 6 months later, Adolf Hitler invades Denmark and Norway, which is northern part of Northern Europe. A month later, he invades Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and is on the French border. Um, let's see here, May 10th, the German Blitzkrieg and the German tanks cross over into the forest and then into France. It takes them literally 6 weeks to conquer France and humiliate the French, who were completely unprepared for what happened. Now, I have some pictures on here that are kind of interesting. I always tell people how shocking it would have been if you were a French person living in Paris to wake up on the morning in May of 1940 and to see this picture on the front page of your newspaper: Adolf Hitler and his cronies marching across the Eiffel Tower Plaza, gloating at their swift and amazing victory over the weak French army. It's a iconic picture. They've got their trench coats on. The Eiffel Tower is in the background. It's really, really startling and scary. There's another very famous picture of Adolf Hitler with two of his closest compadres on a bridge above the plaza area with the Eiffel Tower in the back. This is a lot of tourists today when they visit Paris. That bridge is still there. A lot of people will reenact this photo just for the historical narrative of it. When Chapman and Chris, my husband Chris, were in Paris a couple summers ago, I asked them to find the bridge and recreate the photo for me. And so there's a picture of it here. My husband is standing where Hitler would have been standing. It's pretty creepy, actually. But on the bridge there now is a plaque that reads something about this is the location of the famous picture. And they've got some fences in front of it, so you can't lean up right against it. But effectively, you're standing in the same spot that Hitler was. Hitler wanted to humiliate the French people, the French military in particular. And so at the end of World War I, as we talked about, the Germans were required to sign a war guilt clause and pay millions and millions of dollars in reparations. I think it's actually billions of dollars in reparation payments to the Allies because of what they had done in starting the war. And so the train car where the war guilt clause was signed, the treaty was signed that just poured heaps of coal and embarrassment on the German people, was kept for posterity's sake in a beautiful park outside of Paris. I don't know if it was called Liberty Park or what it was, but it was dedicated to the end of World War I and the defeat of the German nation. And so Hitler decided it would be just a really cool idea to have the French people, the French leaders, be marched down this Liberty Park or whatever it was called, and to see the Nazi party emblem and the German flag draped over their beloved French park, and have them sign their own surrender inside the same train car, which was situated there as a memorial. And so there's some pictures here that show the World War I, and then Adolf Hitler kind of gloating as he's waiting for the French leaders to show up. And then I have just like a 3-minute video. The Nazi propaganda had recorded, they had recorded it for show back home. And it's just fascinating to see Adolf Hitler kind of grinning and waiting to meet the delegation, and just the pomp and circumstance of his victory. It's kind of, I would say this was the high point of his victory, watching them sign that surrender. So I'd like for you to watch that. Let's see here, what else? Okay, I need to switch slides here. All right, so as the British and the French armies are quickly trying to scat out of the German blitzkrieg's way, the British and the French armies naturally, they were unable to defend Paris, and so they moved north of Paris, and they're moving towards the island of Great Britain. Of course, the English Channel is in between them and Great Britain, and they find themselves trapped in a little town called Dunkirk, along the English coast, or along the, not the English coast, the French coast and the English Channel. It's a very famous battle called the Battle of Dunkirk, and it took place between May and June of 1940, at the same time they were approaching Paris. And 400,000 French and British troops were trapped on this beach. It could have been a complete and utter catastrophe and it could have ended the war in that weekend, essentially. For some reason, Adolf Hitler ordered his tank divisions, his panzers, I think they're called, to stop and pause, and sent some aircraft over the scene. I think maybe they suspected they were being trapped because it was so easy. In the meantime, Winston Churchill, who's newly elected Prime Minister of Great Britain, is like, what do I do? He's freaked out because he doesn't want to send his Navy into this narrow channel and have German submarines and German airplanes obliterate his ships before they even have a chance to rescue these men. And he waits and he pauses and he waits and he pauses. And he makes a really incredible decision. And he decides that rather than sending in his ships to retrieve these 400,000 sitting ducks, that he is going to call in merchant ships and individual citizen ships. Anybody that got a boat, go to Dunkirk. And so thousands of boats of all sizes, tugboats, everything you can imagine, start flooding the coastline there and picking up as many men as they can and making a fast dash across the English Channel. I think that I read somewhere that the channel at some points is only like 30 miles across. And so most of the men were rescued from that beach, which again is just absolutely amazing. There were a few British airplanes that got in the mix and scattered the German airplanes away. A lot of people died on the beach. A lot of ships were sunk on the beach or near the beach, but most of the men were rescued, and it was an absolute miracle. Now, I will say, if you've seen the movie Dunkirk, there were two movies that came out about this particular battle. One of them was more about Winston Churchill, and the other one was about the Battle of Dunkirk. It's kind of confusing because it goes back and forth in time, and if you don't know the story, it's kind of like, what is happening? If you know the story, it's fascinating, but it's definitely worth watching. You get a really good feel for how desperate the situation was. I recommend the one that's, I think it's about, I can't remember what it's called, maybe Churchill. But anyway, I believe Adolf Hitler believed that Great Britain would surrender because Hitler believed that the English were part of that Anglo-Saxon master race and that they would be willing to adhere to some sort of German governance if they were not an occupied island. And so he really felt convinced that after seeing all of the damage that he had done and captured France, captured Poland, North Africa, that Winston Churchill would bow the knee to him. And Winston Churchill famously said, "Oh no, we will not surrender. We will not surrender a single inch of our island to you. We will fight everywhere. We will never surrender." And he gave a very famous fiery speech, which then began the Battle of Britain. And so Hitler was mad. He's like, "Are you kidding me? You're not going to surrender." And so he began several months bombing blitzkrieg over the city of London, all over the island of England. But he lost so many airplanes in the fight to take the island that he decided it wasn't worth it. And so after a few months, he gave up. And he said, "You know what? We'll harass you every now and then, but we're going to turn our eyes eastward." And that is when Adolf Hitler turns his sights on Russia. Another fatal mistake. All right, let me jump back into my pictures here. So the Battle of Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain. The German Air Force is called the Luftwaffe, just so that you know that. The Battle of Britain took place in the summer of 1940. 2,000 German planes dropped bombs over the various places on the island. They targeted London in particular. The Royal Air Force was tasked with protecting some of the more precious locations, like in London, like the Tower Bridge, St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey. All of those were protected by the Royal Air Force. And after every night of bombing, when everything would calm in the morning, Winston Churchill would come up from where the barracks he was staying in, and he would walk around and he would look at the damage, and the people would come and walk with him. And there's pictures of here. I'm amazed that all the men are wearing suits and ties. They're walking around this rubble, but at the time that's how they dressed. Thousands of people in London died. If you remember the movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the kids in the very opening scene of that particular episode, the kids are in their home outside of London, and there's a bombing attack, and they almost die, and their mom decides to send them on the train out to the countryside where they meet up with their crazy uncle. And they find the wardrobe. So that is the Battle of Britain, is the setting of the movie The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And Narnia, of course. Let's see here. So there's lots of pictures of that here. Okay, so during this time, Winston Churchill is begging Franklin Roosevelt to encourage America to declare war on Germany. We're already sending as much weaponry as we can to the Soviets once he invades Russia, to the Chinese, who are fighting off the Japanese. America institutes, Congress passes a law called the cash and carry policy, which allowed us to basically neutralize the Neutrality Act, and said that as long as the British can use their own ships and they can pay cash, we'll give them whatever they want. And so they would come, pick up their stuff, and go back. The U.S. also instituted the first peacetime military draft in American history. They started drafting men and training them. And when Great Britain eventually runs out of cash, the French run out of cash, Roosevelt connives, or he kind of works this agreement with the Congress, what becomes known as the Lend-Lease Plan. And in the Lend-Lease Plan, we're going to lend them the weapons, we're going to lease it to them, and they're going to pay us later when the war's over. They'll just pay us later. So effectively, we were in the fight. We just hadn't declared war. Another thing, unfortunately, we had to do is we had to support Joseph Stalin, who was also begging us for weapons at this point because Hitler had invaded Russia. And so we are talking about ending the Depression. We're cranking out weapons like nobody's business, and we are not even at war yet, but we're effectively funding the war on all fronts. So the Neutrality Act of 1935, the cash and carry policy of the 1940s, and the Lend-Lease Act are all really important, associated with this particular topic. At some point, Franklin Roosevelt, again, before we would declare war, gives our Navy the permission to shoot on site any German U-boat they see. Don't wait till they shoot at you. You shoot them first. So you can take a preemptive attack against them. And then, of course, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack our naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Unfortunately, our aircraft carriers were not there. The attack went on for several hours. And let me look at my statistics here. Oh, I don't have the statistics here, darn it. I thought I had written down the number of people that died. I know until September 11th, it was the largest casualty in an attack on American soils until 9/11. That was December 7th, 1941. And then I'm going to go into just a few little random things here in just a second, but one of the biggest, I would say, controversial things that Roosevelt did during the war in response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was the internment of Japanese Americans. I think 2/3 of them were American citizens. There were over 100,000 of them that were rounded up, mostly in California, and they were forced to leave their homes, their businesses. Most of them lost everything, and they had to go live in these internment camps that sort of looked like barracks for maybe a military base where guys would be going to boot camp. Most of them were fenced off. Effectively were kept there against their will. However, no matter what any historian says, this is not the same as the Holocaust. So it's completely different. It was wrong. It was a complete violation of their civil rights. It was prejudiced, it was racist, it was racially motivated, but sometimes you do things in wartime that are not justifiable now, but had we lived it and been there, we may have supported it. We may have been, fearful of this enemy that had just killed thousands of Americans without even declaring war. So I don't think that it was the right thing to do, but I get really frustrated when I hear people compare it to the Holocaust. It wasn't the Holocaust. That's a whole different level. When the war ended, people were allowed to return to whatever home what they had left, but it was catastrophic for the Japanese Americans. Couple of important things that you need to know related to those Japanese internment camps, and they were all over the country. There's one near Fort Smith. There was one in South Arkansas. They were literally spread out all over the country. But the executive order that ordered the internment of Japanese Americans was Executive Order 9066. 9066. So that's kind of an iconic number and iconic executive order. So I wanted to draw that to your attention. I've seen that used before. So Executive Order 9066 called for the internment, the temporary holding of Japanese Americans during the course of the war. Another important aspect of that, and I probably didn't write it down here. Let me see if I didn't. Ooh. Okay, so it's not here. Korematsu versus the United States, and that starts with a K. Mr. Korematsu, I think that's how you say his name. He refused to leave his home, and he filed a lawsuit against the government. It made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. This all has to do with the Japanese internment, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was not a violation of their constitutional civil rights. In a time of war, the government has powers that it would not otherwise have, and that for the safety of the country, this was a legal internment. And so Mr. Korematsu lost that case. And if I remember correctly, eventually Japanese Americans were paid some sort of reparations for their losses during the war, but I'm not sure how that fleshed out. So it won't matter. You don't need to know that. But that popped into my mind. Another thing related to just civil rights, I'm just going to throw this out here. It was in my reading. Executive Order 8802. This is dealing with, he has a whole section in the chapter about how Black Americans were treated during the war. And because there was still that underlying Black citizens were treated kind of second tier citizens, they faced a lot of discrimination in the industrial wartime industry. They were able to get employment, but they oftentimes were paid less, worked longer hours, and they organized and drew a lot of public attention to this. And so FDR did something he should have done. He issued Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in defense jobs and established a Fair Employment Practice Commission to monitor its compliance. And so this was a huge step forward in drawing attention to the fact that Black Americans were discriminated against in the workplace based upon the color of their skin. And that's going to have far-reaching implications in the future. Okay. Real quick, I'm going to jump down here and I'm going to talk about the Pacific front of the war and the European front of the war. So I'm going to do this very quickly. In the Pacific Islands, once the Japanese attacked America, the intent was to disable the U.S. Navy long enough that they could gobble up all kinds of land all the way down to Australia, all the way back up into Southeast and South Asia. And they assumed that by the time they were able to do that, it would be too late for America to displace them. And so it took about 18 months for America to get up, maybe not that long, 12 months maybe, to kind of get into the fight and recoup from the losses at Pearl Harbor. But again, because our aircraft carriers had been away from Pearl Harbor, we had that going for us. And I will say aircraft carriers are probably, outside of the atomic bomb, one of the most significant new inventions of warfare, because it allowed a country or a military unit to move their airplanes without necessarily needing land to refuel and that sort of thing. So fortunately they weren't there. And so during that time frame from when we were able to get back into the fight, the Japanese had gobbled up all kinds of land. They had captured the Philippines from the United States, which we had garnered during the Spanish-American War. The largest surrender of an American force was in the Philippines, in Bataan. 78,000 American soldiers and some civilian contractors and such were taken prisoner. They were told to put their arms down because the army knew they would just be massacred. And so they were marched to POW camps. Thousands of them died along the way. That's called the Bataan Death March. Um, let's see here, what else? And once Americans were engaged in the Pacific battle, they assumed the posture of island jumping. And so they went all the way down to the Coral Sea, which is near Australia, which was Japan's big target. And that was our first success. We were able to, in the Battle of Coral Sea, we were able to prevent the Japanese from taking the Australian mainland there. From there, as we began to jump from island to island, we got information, we broke a code, and discovered that several Japanese aircraft carriers were, we found out where they were, and they didn't know we knew where they were. And so just like Pearl Harbor had been a surprise attack, we were able to surprise attack their carriers, and we dealt them a crippling blow. I think we sunk 4 of their carriers, which was utterly devastating. And they essentially, Midway was payback for Pearl Harbor. So if you have not seen the movie The Battle of Midway, or I think it's just called Midway, fantastic, absolutely fantastic. I think there's maybe a handful of bad words in it, and that's pretty much it. It is, if you want to know what it's like to be in a cockpit shooting at a Japanese battleship that is firing at you, it's the movie for you. It's just really, really, it's based on a true story of some of the men that fought at the Battle of Midway. So Coral Sea, Midway, island hopping, aircraft carriers. Of course, as the Japanese realized their time was limited, they got desperate and started using kamikaze attacks, which were flying their airplanes into our ships. Another aspect that's really important to know about the Japanese is that they never surrendered a single island. They fought to the death, or they committed suicide. And so the thought of a Japanese mainland invasion was quite terrifying prospect for our generals, our admirals. We used a language for our code, the Navajo language, which is an unwritten language. It was the code that we used or was the language we used in our codes in the Pacific, and it was never broken. And then, of course, the Manhattan Project developed the atomic bomb, which was ultimately used upon Japan against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We'll talk about that in just a second. Okay, on the European front, real quickly, I'm just going to go through kind of the significant operations and how this played out. So you'd think we would have invaded Europe in France. That's where we would start. And that is not where we started. That's where Winston Churchill didn't want us to start in France. He thought that we Americans needed to fight a while and get bloody. He thought we were green, and that we would not perform well when we needed to, and that we needed to get a little experience. And so he volleyed for an initial attack in North Africa, where the Nazi army had gobbled up all of North Africa for their oil. Erwin Rommel was the Desert Fox. He was a famous German tank division leader, and he was the one that was occupying North Africa. And so the Allies ended up going with that. Dwight Eisenhower was in charge of that operation. And so the first boots on the ground in the Eastern Hemisphere, I guess you guys actually still what in the fight against the Germans was in North Africa. And so our troops, I believe, landed in Morocco and Algeria, and that was called Operation Torch. And so the way I always remembered it when I was in high school and college is it's hot in Africa. So Operation Torch. And we made our way across North Africa. Ultimately, as we approached Egypt, the area of Egypt, Erwin Rommel ended up finally surrendering, and which was devastating for Adolf Hitler. Then we jumped onto the island of Sicily in the Mediterranean, and then onto the boot of Italy. Mussolini had been essentially defunct in Italy. The people rose up against him because he was terrible. He was ultimately killed by his own people. When Adolf Hitler realized that Italy was perhaps going to fall to the Allies and recognized the vulnerability of having the Allies right up underneath Germany, he sent in a huge division into the mountains on the northern part of Italy. and the Allies actually never broke through fully, I don't think. I think Italy was kind of a lost cause, or at least the northern part of Italy. And so the Germans were able to hold Italy and prevent that underbelly of Germany from being attacked from underneath there. Joseph Stalin and his folks are coming in from the east. Hitler made a terrible decision. They went deep into Russia and attacked Stalingrad, lost millions of men. In fact, I think the book says 2/3 of the 13 million Germans that died, about 10 million of them died in the Eastern Front. And then they got stuck there in the wintertime, and we know how that goes. So they end up getting their supply lines cut off and having to surrender to the Russian forces. And so so things were closing in on Adolf Hitler. Finally, the D-Day invasion happened, which was the invasion of the northern beaches of France. And Normandy is sort of in the northwest corner of that area. And that operation was called Operation Overlord. It was the largest amphibious landing in human history. Over the course of a month, 1 million boots landed on those beaches. You'll see some pictures of it here. And ultimately, the British and the French troops came in from the west. The Russian troops came in from the east. And as they got closer and closer to Adolf Hitler, there was one last battle called the Battle of the Bulge that Hitler sent everything he had into the middle of the line in France. And they actually gained about 50 miles of land. 70,000 American soldiers died in the Battle of the Bulge trying to hold that line, and ultimately it did fail, and the surge towards Berlin continued. And Adolf Hitler saw a picture in the newspaper of Mussolini and his girlfriend and a couple of others hanging upside down, dead as a doorknob, at a Italian gas station. I think he saw the image about a week before he decided to take his own life. And so as Allied troops came into the city of Berlin, Adolf Hitler supposedly took poison and killed himself, and ordered that once they thought he was dead, to shoot him and then to set his body on fire, because he did not want to happen to him what had happened to Mussolini. And so Adolf Hitler is dead. I have listed here concentration camps. You have to know what the Holocaust is. I think that most of you have a fairly good understanding of what it was. It was the systematic destruction or attempted destruction of an entire race of people. In addition to that, the Nazis also targeted gypsies and Eastern European people. Did I say gypsies already? He targeted homosexuals, handicapped people, political activists, anybody he didn't like. But the Jews were especially targeted, and of course they were blamed by him for World War I. What happened to the Jewish people is beyond words. It's unexplainable. I can't even believe it happened. When I look at pictures of it, I just think, how did that happen? How did that happen? It's horrific, and I think you guys have received instruction on this in a variety of classes. I think you've even read something in English, and so I'm not going to elaborate on it. But I do want you to I want you to understand that thankfully General Eisenhower had the wherewithal to tell his soldiers to record everything that they saw and to take pictures. Because when he came upon these camps, he thought to himself, nobody will ever believe this. It's so horrific, no one will ever believe it. And so fortunately, history has recorded the horrible things that happened to the Jewish people there. All right. May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders. I'm almost done, by the way. I have to mention Rosie the Riveter. A third of the workforce during World War II were women. In 1944, a third of the workforce were women. Rosie the Riveter was a image that portrayed women's role in the war. Okay. All right, so you would think that after the defeat of Hitler that the Japanese would call it quits, but they did not. They were a very proud people, and as I mentioned before, they never surrendered. And so Franklin Roosevelt had a stroke about 3 months or so into his 4th term, making his new vice president, Harry Truman, a senator from Missouri, president of the United States. Harry Truman was unaware of the Manhattan Project, and he was approached by his probably national security team, or maybe his Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'm not sure who told him, but they told him about the bomb, and they said, we have a few, and I suggest that you use it, because if you have to invade the mainland of Japan, you're looking at millions of soldiers lost and countless numbers of civilians. And so through a course of political discourse, trying to convince the Japanese to surrender, they wouldn't. 2 towns were targeted, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The figures vary depending on how many people were killed instantly and how many people died from problems later, but probably 250,000 people were killed as a result of the 2 bombs, maybe even more than that. The Japanese finally did surrender. They surrendered on the USS Missouri. I don't know if it was chosen because President Truman was from Missouri. I'm not sure about that. But Douglas MacArthur, who had been the general in one of the generals in the Pacific, was tasked with setting Japan on a footing for republicanism and democracy, and he was stationed in Japan after the war. There's some pictures here of Hiroshima and Nagasaki before and now. I think it's pretty interesting. And then finally, while we don't have to know anything about the Cold War for the test because that's in the next period, woohoo! I think it is important to know that the United Nations that serves the world today, representatives from all around the world, all countries in the world, the Security Council of the United Nations is 5 countries who have permanent veto power, and those 5 countries are the countries that were the allies in World War II. That fought against the Nazis. And so China is included because we were helping them defeat the Japanese. Russia, because Russia was our ally fighting the Nazis. France, Great Britain, and the United States. Those 5 countries that serve on the permanent national, what did I call them? Permanent, I can't remember what I called it. Anyway, the United Nations Security Council. Those came out of World War II. I didn't know that. I realized that last year. I was like, oh, I always wondered why China was on there, and now I know. Anyway, okay, so wow. It's been over an hour. I know I've been talking for way too long. I apologize for that. I will include some videos for today's lesson that will reinforce some of the things that you'll see in the PowerPoint, some of the things that I've shared, and then I am going to assign you Mr. Heimler's period 7 videos for homework. And then I'm also going to spend some time tomorrow recording, just going over some of that factual information and anything else that I think that you might want to review prior to the test. If you have any questions, please feel free. You can call me. I'll put my phone number in my, I've already done that, but I'll put it in my message for tomorrow or for your lesson that you're watching. I'd be happy to talk through with anything. I know Bethany has been watching some of the videos that are on AP Central from, I guess you call them master teachers who are teaching through all of these periods. And if you have extra time, it probably would benefit you. More than anything else though right now, practice writing a thesis. I'm going to send you just a whole bunch of, I'm going to do this tomorrow, what a good thesis looks like. And of course, Mr. Heimler also worked through that on one of those videos that you were supposed to watch. So I'm exhausted. I think that's it. I'm looking forward to finding out how y'all are doing. So please, again, if you have any questions, let me know. You should be getting your ticket, I guess tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow via email. So I'll probably be checking with you guys to make sure you got it. So anyway, love you guys. See ya. Bye.